concerned group.
Good morning, Madam Commissioner. Good morning, Minister. Neil Chandler for the Chinese Canadian Concern Group. Minister, I'll start with some questions about the relationship between the Minister of Public Safety and the RCMP. I don't expect this to be too controversial. I expect you'll agree that the Minister plays an important oversight role with respect to the RCMP and is ultimately accountable for the RCMP to Parliament and to the Canadian public.
Yes.
And concurrently, the RCMP operates independently in its law enforcement activities, meaning the minister does not interfere with operational decisions, such as investigations or prosecutions.
Yes.
But the minister can set priorities for the RCMP, especially concerning issues of national security, public safety, and organized crime, without infringing on the operational independence of the RCMP.
That is correct.
And that is to say that when an issue of national security arises, the minister has some ability to influence the degree to which the RCMP prioritizes the matter.
There's certainly a conversation that occurs between the minister and the various agencies, which I was ultimately accountable for in the shaping of those priorities. I think that's fair.
I'm going to shift my focus to the overseas police stations, which you've talked about. But first, as an aside, you were asked today by Commission Counsel about the concerns of one individual who appeared before this inquiry and suggested that the overseas police station should not have been shut down because they were offering valuable services to the community. I hope you'll agree with me that such concerns are enormously overshadowed by the preponderance of CSIS intelligence suggesting these stations are being used as bases for illegal activity.
I would agree that there was a difference of opinion, and probably still is, about exactly what the nature of these overseas police stations was vis-a-vis foreign interference, and that is why I leaned heavily on my officials to give advice about what the threat was. What was being done about it in my time was the issuance of a CSIS alert, as you've heard, and then the RCMP deployed some disruption techniques by placing marked cars in front of the OPSs that I've been briefed about. That's all public, and that I was briefed that to the extent that there were any foreign interference activities associated with these satellites, that they had been shut down at the time.
You'd agree we should be cautious of such narratives, which are consistent with the very kinds of foreign interference and disinformation that we are seeking to combat in this inquiry.
Which narrative is that?
The narrative that these overseas police stations were in fact doing public service, they were performing valuable services for the Chinese Canadian community.
Well, as I've said throughout this morning, I do think we've got to be prudent generally about how we talk about foreign interference, and that as we move into the public space, that it is measured by the advice that we get from independent public officials with expertise to assess, and where appropriate, to hand over that intelligence to law enforcement so that they can be prosecuted. And again, I do think it is worth stressing that Bill C-70 does provide additional tools to prosecute people who may be acting at the direction of or in association with one of our adversaries for the purposes of undermining our democracy.
You were taken through your interview summary earlier in your examination in chief, and you suggested that you were briefed on the presence of these overseas police stations in late 2022 or early 2023. Are you able to put any more precision on that?
I can't. I can't. I think that's about as best as I can do.
I asked your colleague, Deputy Minister Tupper, about these the other day, and he said that within days of the overseas police stations coming to light, there was a coordination meeting led by public safety. I think I heard him say that we quickly came to an understanding of the problem and some conclusions on the best course of action. Were you at that meeting, or were you briefed on that meeting?
Well, certainly I would have been briefed. I just don't know within the institutional report, maybe you've got a specific date in mind which meeting Mr. Tupper was referring to, but I can tell you that I know Mr. Tupper, as my deputy minister, took this file seriously and had me briefed, and that occurred sometime in late 2022 or 2023.
Could that have been September 2022, which was the month that the Safeguard Defenders report came out and brought these overseas police stations to light?
I think if you had a specific reference in the institutional report that showed that the deputy minister had meeting amongst officials without me being there, of course, I would agree with it. I adopted the report earlier. But in terms of when I was briefed, and there is a difference between the pre-briefing that gets done, the work that gets done by officials, and the briefing to the minister himself in my case. But my recollection is it was sometime in late 2022.
I'm going to ask you now about the response to these stations. And could the court operator please put up WIT 144? This is the in-camera examination summary of Deputy Tupper and his colleagues. And at the bottom of page 17 is where the issue of the overseas police stations comes up.
Right.
You may not have read this, but I'll take you to the next page in paragraph 66, where Deputy Minister Tupper describes the approach that was taken. And about 5 lines down, he says, the OPS situation demonstrated the value in looking to tools beyond arrests and prosecutions. The RCMP deployed uniformed officers to the stations to make their presence known and engage with the local community. There's a general tenor that the approach was different to these police stations than might have been typical in another situation involving alleged organized crime. And I'm going to ask you about the degree to which your office, as Minister of Public Safety at the time, may have known about that different approach, the decision made to approach things that way, or any influence you might have had. Can you tell me, from your perspective as Public Safety Minister at that time, was there any consideration given to the broader political context that this was an issue of national security that would have implications for the Canada-China relationship?
Look, we've talked in general terms about the concerns that I would have had at the time about the rapidly evolving nature of foreign interference as deployed by certain adversaries. We've gone through some of the examples, including overseas police stations. I will say in response that, of course, I was mindful of the broader geopolitical context of Canada-China relations, the Russian invasion into Ukraine, but the central question at hand was how do we prevent, mitigate, and otherwise enforce against this type of foreign interference in the form of these overseas police stations? And my thinking at the time was, one, let me defer, as I should, to the intelligence and RCMP who were tackling the issue head on through the issuance of a public alert to raise awareness, but also through the disruptive operations which had been put into place. As at the same time, we were moving forward with Bill C-70. And Bill C-70, I agree with the passage in the summary a little bit earlier on, was not a complete and total response to overseas police stations, but it was another arrow in our quiver because it created new offenses that allowed us to go after people who were acting at the direction of or in association with an adversary, a foreign state, for the purposes of undermining the Canadian national interest.
Sir, I understand you were very alive to the issues at the time. My question specifically is, was there any pressure from your office on down to the RCMP as to how they should respond to this, how they should prioritize it?
No.
And do you know if your deputies or any at any level below you, there were considerations about the Canada-Chinese relationship, any fear that China might retaliate to an aggressive response to these police stations?
Well, again, we were all mindful of the climate that we were in, and the Canada-Chinese relationship was at a very sensitive juncture at that point. But the primary focus was to deal with the situation at hand. And in the context of these briefings, we were listening to the advice that we were getting from CSIS and from the RCMP about how they were reducing that threat, while at the same time pushing forward with policy and legislative reforms to give them yet more tools so that if overseas police stations were continuing to proliferate in the form of these satellites and transnational repression, that they had another tool that they could use to go after those individuals.
The Prime Minister was briefed on the issue in October. Do you accept that? I don't have the document reference handy.
again, I mean, if I have no reason to dispute it, I don't know which document or institutional report you're referring to.
Do you have any reason to believe that the Prime Minister weighed on this decision as to how to respond to this very delicate political issue of these overseas police stations operating in Canada?
I know the Prime Minister was routinely briefed on matters of intelligence and national security, and I'm sure he took those briefings extremely seriously, as did I.
Thank you for your answer, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.